I know I'm cutting you off the path. That's okay. Come on back. Let's take some notes. Let's do some discussing. And then we're going to look at some passages in Luke's gospel to get us where we need to be. Okay, so what from this article stands out to you?
I just the last part, at the very last part.
Yeah.
It says the gospel changes the story about woman. And it talks about how since he uses women from a wide range of social status in life, it changed perception about them.
Okay. What else? Yeah.
There are 13 women in Luke that appear only in.
Why does it matter to you specifically?
I think it emphasizes the fact that Luke is emphasizing women in the story.
I agree. What else?
It says that woman was the first to witness the resurrection, which is probably one of the biggest events in the history of the earth.
Yep.
And so, it said before that, they weren't able to give testimony to something.
Yeah, right.
And so, them being women and telling everyone Jesus is alive, it's out of the norm, I guess.
Sure. Cultural norms and laws in the first century, women's testimony was valid in a legal standing. They had to have other people corroborate their testimony. That's the way it was. So let me ask it this way. If this is the case, right, the witness and the testimony of women is discounted in general public and society and life in the first century as we know it, right? If that's the case, then does it make sense that our gospel writers are consistent, Luke especially so, that the first individuals to witness the resurrected Jesus are women? If you're going to set out and tell the story, would you make up the fact that the first witnesses and the most consistent witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus were women?
Well, and if he was only asking eyewitnesses, that means that he would have had to have believed the women that said that they were at the tomb.
Fair. Luke has trusted their account. The apostles, to some extent, trust their account. Right? I mean, Mary and Mary come back to the apostles to say, hey, look, he rose. And Peter and John go to the tomb to see it for themselves. But think about it this way, because one of the claims against early Christians was it's made up. He didn't really rise, he just stashed his body someplace. If the story's made up, and you're the one making it up, would you have women be the first witnesses to the resurrection then? Does that make sense, right? Why wouldn't you put witnesses that general society would have considered credible witnesses? It would have been like the Roman guard or something, not these women. Instead, the story, the guards are passed out and it's the women who witnessed Jesus. Yeah? Venture into some, I don't know, interesting waters, I guess, some perspective-based waters here. Ladies, there's only 3 of you in the room today, anyway. What does Luke's emphasis on women in the Gospel of Luke, what does that say to you? What does that mean to you? What does that hold any significance, or maybe not yet? We got to figure it out. I mean, you talked about, right? There's 13 women that feature in the Gospel of Luke that only feature in the text of the Gospel of Luke. Is that significant?
I think that it just shows that everyone is made in the image of God, and it doesn't matter whether or not you're a male or female.
Do you think maybe that's part of Luke's point? Do you think that's maybe part of Jesus' point? Right? We noted in the genealogy yesterday, right? The genealogy goes all the way back to Adam because it's a human story, it's a human problem, it's a human solution, it's a humanity thing. This Jesus and what he's doing. That humanity thing involves Gentiles. It involves individuals who are part of the family of Abraham. It involves individuals that aren't. It involves women. It involves Romans. We're going to see that in chapter 7 today. I think you're onto something with that sort of expansion. Yeah. Risky question, but I'm going to endeavor it anyway. Does Christianity still find ways to sort of drift some of our human family, some of our family of God into the quiet spaces? We still find ways as Christians to marginalize voices,
So, sometimes.
to not listen, to discount, discredit,
I feel like
keep quiet certain groups.
Like we're unopen to anyone else. Like we already have a set of like beliefs down, and we like
We're not willing to listen.
we're not willing to listen to this because we already think we have it down.
Yeah.
I think I kind of understand. Like, I feel like we have to understand that, like, even if you're like have different traditions or like different the things, like I feel like I can see a lot of judgment sometimes
Sure.
by the way different churches roll, or like the way different churches' music is, or the way different how they just worship God as a whole. And I feel like we gotta understand that at the same time there's still one purpose instead of like,
Sure.
trying to make it like a show almost.
We need to do better at agreeing on what we agree on.
Yeah.
And when the disagreements are minor things, just letting them be,
Yeah.
instead of beating each other up over it. Yeah, I agree completely.
My dad's in the middle of writing like a 20-page paper
Sure.
on it's about like disregard the non-essential things we disagree on
Mhm.
and be unified in the essential things
That we do agree on. Right, yeah.
because we all have that one purpose, which is to discipleship.
To know, understand, live the gospel and share it with other people. I agree. Go ahead.
I would say that there is a lot of infighting.
Oh,
between,
sure.
Denominations. And I like what you guys have to say. Really over like symbolism or the different customs. It's the small, big things that are really important to those certain
Yep.
denominations. And it may be important to them. But it really doesn't matter. Yeah.
But are they worth fighting and breaking Christian fellowship over? Okay, so I think this is one of the things that Luke's gospel speaks to the strongest, because he highlights these kinds of things, because he emphasizes who Jesus is. I'm going to put it in like social norms terms for the first century. He emphasizes people who don't matter in the first century world, because to Jesus, we all matter. And it's getting to that point where we're willing to pay attention to the voices and we're willing to listen. Perhaps specifically to certain groups or certain individuals Because people, Christians and non-Christians, have done a good job of not listening or rejecting or disregarding those voices for a long time. And to be totally honest and fair with you, Christians have done a good job of that. I mean, we're not perfect, right? And we have our faults, and we have our infighting, and we have our things that we have to sort out. But Christians globally and historically have done a really good job of listening to the voices of widows and orphans and the disenfranchised and the marginalized and the rejected and the mistreated, right? Primarily a group of Christians in England that helped stop and the slave trade. It's Christians throughout the world and throughout history that have established orphanages and hospitals and have been vocal proponents for rights for these individuals and equal treatment of people who haven't had it. Okay? I think we forget that somebody like Martin Luther King's primary employment was as a pastor. And we remember him for the work he did, and we should, when it comes to civil rights. But we forget he was a pastor. It's the voice of the church rising up. We need that. I think Luke is one of those voices. We're going to pay more attention to that as we walk through it. Go ahead, and then we're going to jump into the text.
Was there like times, or did it say that like some like females or like just females couldn't be like pastors or prophets back in the day?
There are some passages in the scripture that make that a little bit complicated. And then there's some passages in the scripture that welcome the voices and the role of women in certain places and spaces. So it's actually something we're going to talk about when we do Paul's letters.
Okay.
How does Paul understand the role of women in the life and ministry of the church? What does he welcome them into? And why might he say, well, don't do this in these circumstances? We're going to sort of talk through
I think
a couple of places in the letters.
all that has to do with context, because
There are some really serious questions around
Yeah.
why does Paul say this in this letter and he says that in that letter. Is it context determined?
yeah, because
What-
like, at church we just like talked a lot about that kind of
Sure.
stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
And we like went through all and was like, okay, let's figure this out. So
Mhm.
a lot of it is context.
A lot of it is context. A lot of it is trying to understand why Paul's making the argument he's making.
Mhm.
And then at what point do we emphasize this? And at what point do we emphasize the context? And at what point do we emphasize what sounds like a theological argument in certain places from the Apostle Paul? And how do we decipher that out? And how do we do so with a lot of humility and grace for people who are looking at those texts in a different way?
It's another one of those denomination tradition things.
It can very quickly become that, absolutely, right? Totally. And while it can, every Christian denomination I have experienced will still say we need the voices of men and women in our churches. We need the role of men and women in our churches. We need the vibrant spiritual life, growth, and development, and teaching of some segment of our church population, of both men and women in our congregation. So we're gonna walk through a little bit more of that as we go this school year. It's gonna challenge some of us, and it's gonna require us to be, nice to each other while we discuss it. Let's go to Luke 7. Okay. Thanks, guys. Let's go to Luke 7. We're done at 11:12. We may not get through all of this, and that is totally okay with me. If we don't, we'll just carry over and we'll pick it up tomorrow. If you haven't been able to tell to this point, our focal point with the Gospel of Luke is what Luke does in presenting Jesus to us as somebody who's accessible, somebody who's available, somebody who's there specifically and strategically for those individuals that the world of the first century would have sort of given the Heisman to and kept at an arm's length and kept on the outskirts. And Luke's gospel is turning all of that upside down and on its head. And Jesus is intentionally and strategically bringing those people into his ministry fold. Chief among them are the women, right? I'm going to keep going back to it, right? 13 women feature specifically in the text of the Gospel of Luke that don't seem to feature anywhere else in the New Testament text. It's incredible when you sit down and think about it. And it's also incredible how quickly we miss it. Not because we're trying to, but because we're so focused on something else. Something good, but we miss, I think, something that might be just as good in the process. So let's keep that in mind. I need somebody to do some reading for me. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 10.
All right.
Just leave it there.
When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. When the officer heard about Jesus, he sent some elected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. If anyone deserves your help, he does, they said. For he loved the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. So Jesus went with them, but just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some princes to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I am not worthy to come. I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only say go, and they go, or come, and they come. If I say to my slave, do this, they do it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, turning to the crowd that was following him. He said, I tell you, I haven't seen great like this in all Israel. And when the officer's friend returned to his house and found his slave completely healed.
Perfect. Thank you. So we're looking at the servant of a Roman centurion, right? We're not just looking at the servant in the house of some run-of-the-mill Jewish guy. I don't mean to make that sound derogatory or defamatory, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at the servant in the house of a Roman centurion. And it just so happens that this particular individual has done a lot. He's built a synagogue, or helped provide the funds to build the synagogue. And he has the support of this group of individuals who come to Jesus and say, hey, look, this guy's legit. Like, you should help him out. And so the Jews around him have supported this individual, and then they're vouching for him with Jesus. But the centurion, let's consider this for a second. Has the centurion gone to see Jesus himself? No. In fact, what does he say about going to see Jesus himself?
He's not worthy.
Yeah, I'm not worthy. He says, look, they decided to go, and that's fine. I didn't consider myself worthy enough to come and have this discussion with you. And ultimately, I know all you have to do is give the order. We'll talk about that in a second. But listen to the stance. This Roman centurion humble. Based on what we've talked about leading up to our study in the New Testament, and based on your experience of looking at Roman characters in the text of the Bible, do you really think that most of the Roman characters Jesus would have encountered would have been relatively humble individuals? No. Would they have been kind and generous and caring to their Jewish counterparts in communities like this? No, this is probably pretty unique. Right? Huh. So Jesus is going to go ahead and do it. Right? Humble. He understands authority. I like this story. Reminds me a lot of being in the Navy. Go! And you go. Do this. You do it. Senior chief says, jump. You say, how high on the way up? That's how it worked. Because that's how it works. And this is his confession, right? I understand how authority works. I discern that you have authority. Just give the order. I don't know what you command, but whatever it is that you command, it happens. So you just give the order and woo! I trust it. It'll be done. That's exactly what happens, right? He gives the command, poof, it's done. Jesus says this. This is great faith. He actually goes as far and he says, I haven't seen faith like this, even in Israel. This Roman centurion doesn't have the history. He doesn't have the track record and the relationship with God that we have. He doesn't have any of that. But guess what? He's got faith like nobody I've ever seen. I'm sorry. If Jesus says you have faith like nobody I've ever seen, pay attention. It's not me making that statement. It's Jesus making that statement. Okay, but I want to drive this point home. Who has that faith? It's a Roman centurion. Does a Roman centurion have any business having this kind of faith at all? No. Luke's highlighting it again. As far as the Jewish world was concerned, this is one of those outsiders. This is one of those outcasts, rejected, marginalized, disenfranchised. In fact, that's a different kind of level of the outcast, marginalized, and disenfranchised, because this is not only the outcast and the marginalized and the disenfranchised from Jewish society, this is the oppressor. Granted, he hasn't done a whole lot of oppressing. He built them a synagogue, but still. This individual represents everything that is Roman oppression of Jews in the first century, and he's the one who has this kind of faith. Are you kidding? There couldn't be a more anti-political statement from Jesus than this one right here. The oppressor demonstrates the faith. Something to consider. Let's read a couple more in the text here. Somebody read for me 11 through 17.
Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain,
Mm-hmm.
and his disciples and a large crowd went following him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. God has come to help his people. This news about this spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country.
Okay. So we're told a few things about this individual, right? So we have a couple of characters. We have a son who happens to be dead. Not a good start. And we have his mother, right? What else do we know about the mother?
She's a widow.
She's a widow. Is that any kind of particular problem?
Yeah. Did you say that if there was a widow in Jewish society at that time, that they couldn't do anything legal?
Yeah, they have no legal standing. So, ladies, in the first century world, all of your legal protections and standing in society had to be guaranteed by a male relative.
Wouldn't they marry their husband's brother?
Yeah, potentially. It might be a functional, right? Let me give you legal standing and protect you.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the first century, marrying sisters-in-law and whatever may not have been the practice. But bringing them into the home, yeah, and sort of making them part of the extended family to protect and give them access to legal standing and that kind of would have been standard practice. In this particular instance, we have a son who's the only son of his mother. I think we're told that, right? He's dead, and she's a widow.
Dang.
Is this going to go well for her?
No.
No. Listen, the son comes back to life, but the story is all about the mother. Son's got no cares and concerns. He's dead. Like, if you want to play it forward in a good light, he's on his way to be with God in paradise. Like, if anything in bringing him back to life is a bit of a disadvantage. Well, maybe, but let's just play it to the positive end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Let's not assume he went, okay? So hang on.
Ice water.
Most times, you better work.
She's in trouble. She's in trouble. Son, well, he's already dead. Here's the thing. When we read these stories, we tend to focus on what Jesus does for the person that he's doing it for. And listen, it's a good thing to an extent, maybe. I don't know. I want to be at the dinner table after that. Be like, look, Mom, glad to take care of you. But I was like,
Kind of enjoying it.
I was in the good place. So, like, I don't know. Nice to be back. Good to see you. It was kind of fun over there, though. Like, yeah, right. How does that conversation go? I mean, maybe, who knows? The focus in this story is not on what Jesus has done for the son. I mean, maybe he gave him a second chance, to go from to the good place. Maybe he was already in the good place. That may be a disadvantage to the son. We don't know. The focus isn't on the son. The focus is on his mother. Because without him in the house, chances are she's broke. She's going to lose her home and property. I mean, there's at least a potential for it. And she's going to be without legal recourse to protect herself or guarantee her estate. That's the setup of the story. There's no other male heir or relative or anything like that. It's her and her son. So when her son's gone, she's in a lot of trouble. The miracle's great. Jesus raises somebody from the dead. Woohoo! But you know what he's just done? It's an act of provision for this mother. Right? You notice the dead guy's not even named? I mean, she's not exactly named either, but Jesus just rolls into town and sees a funeral procession and goes, yeah, you should get up. Go help your mom.
Good, bro.
Paraphrase version. Right?
Yes.
It actually says, and the dead man sat up.
Can you imagine you're like carrying the dude and you're like, oh, okay.
I mean, they stopped long enough to make sure everything's stable so he doesn't fall over or something.
I'm chopping him up.
By the way, it's the same line when Lazarus is raised in the Gospel of John. The dead man sat up in the Gospel of Luke. We know the guy's name in John. It's Lazarus. It doesn't say that. It says the dead man came out. Making reference to like coming out of the grave. He calls him the dead. He's dead, but he's not dead. Kind of.
Zombie?
Not undead. What? Huh? They're just as confused by it as we are. Was dead, now not dead.
It's a dream.
What do we do with that? The whole point of this story, though, isn't about, hey, look, the son's alive again. That's not the point. The point of the story is this. Jesus just took care of her. Not by, hey, you over here, you help her. But by giving her son back. Right?
It's reminding me a lot of Faramir from Lord of the Rings.
There? You know what this might remind us of? 1 Kings 17. When Elijah visits a widow and a son.
I've never heard this one.
Raises the son and then
Wait, so he was dead.
Oh, man.
asks the widow.
Bring back dead people.
Asks the widow. Says, can we make some bread?
Yeah.
We're all kind of hungry. She says, I only have this much left. It's only enough to make. He goes, go ahead and make it. Don't worry about it. And every time she goes back to the jar to get flour and yeast to make more bread, it's still there. It's the multiplication of bread.
I don't think I've read that one.
This is the story. It sounds like that story in the Elijah time. Go ahead.
I got a quick. So, like, did the Bible give any hints on how like was dude just like to him was he just asleep or like was he really going somewhere and then got
Dead
snatched
means
back?
dead.
I mean, it says he's dead.
Dead means dead.
So
Why don't you send the information how to connect necklace?
on how to?
Yeah.
No, it says don't.
Have you, are there stories of people doing that today?
Today, I'm sure. King Saul does it.
People from Africa.
Yeah, I saw that.
So
So what?
There's like videos of people.
in